8 o'clock. I know there'll be people joining over the next couple, but I will kick off because we are really grateful, particularly for Zali, for racing and joining us, and she's going to speak first. So it's really nice to see everyone. Hi and welcome. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet today, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We're on Gadigal land tonight, and so I wanted to particularly extend my respect to the Gadigal people, particularly, obviously, given the referendum result over the weekend, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Tonight's topic is ramping up the changes, what's happening behind the scenes in relation to climate action and the environment. So we're delighted to have Zali Steggall talking first, and she's going to give us an update from Federal Parliament, and then Terry Butler, who will talk about climate action within industry. And after Terry's presented, there'll be a chance for Q&A as well. So feel free to add any questions to the chat as we go along. So probably Zali doesn't need any introduction, but just in case, delighted to welcome Zali Steggall, OAM MP for Warringah. Zali's a former Olympic medalist, a lawyer, and was elected in 2019, defeating Tony Abbott as the first Teal candidate. She's continued to hold the seat safely, working on focuses such as stronger action on climate, integrity in politics and equality. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on the first night back of Parliament, and after such a big weekend. The main thing I suppose we really wanted to ask you was about what's coming up in this term of government from a climate and environment point of view. But after such a big weekend, I think perhaps the first question, just for a couple of minutes, is, given the weekend we've just had, what's the mood and feeling like in Parliament today?
Thank you, Stephen and Carolyn, and hi everyone. And especially in light of the weekend, I would like to pay my respects to traditional elders, past, present, and in particular anyone joining us tonight here in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And it does feel a little bittersweet or emotional, to recognise that, especially after the weekend. Profoundly disappointed with Australia, but very proud of my community that at least embraced the opportunity. So, and so I'm thankful for that. It would be even more difficult, I think, coming down here to Parliament and seeing the debate. Obviously, in the wake of that, from an integrity point of view, very much redoubling my efforts to push around misleading and deceptive advertising in politics. And there was the opportunity to do it prior to the referendum, and I put that to the government and introduced legislation to that effect. And I think there is actually polling that's going to come out shortly around the exit polls that actually indicates that both yes and no voters felt there was misleading and deceptive advertising in the referendum campaign, and as such support that we legislate. So that's good news, but obviously have been really pushing for that, and we'll be progressing further and having discussions with the government on that. I think we do need to protect our democratic process from misleading and deceptive information. We do that for consumer rights, right? We value our consumer rights to ensure that when we're parting with money, we're not doing so under false promises or pretext. But strangely enough, we don't do that around democratic rights. But the mood in Parliament is, I would say, a little, there's barely contained glee from the opposition, and which I think is quite unseemly. And then obviously there's, I think appropriately the government needs to take a moment of reflection and really consider that this was, that there was a dramatic loss on the weekend when it comes to First Nations Australians that needs to be dealt with. Yes, definitely an agreement of moving forward. What that looks like needs to be done in consultation with First Nations Australians and really looking at those opportunities. But ironically, as we're talking environmental laws and protection, there is a massive opportunity to listen to Indigenous communities when it comes to our management and protection protection of the environment. And today I seconded the private members bill from Dr. Sophie Scoms, the independent from Mackellar, who introduced an amendment to the EPBC Act to introduce a more fulsome water trigger. So there are loopholes around the water trigger at the moment under the EPBC Act. It doesn't cover use of water for fracking, for gas, for example, which is a great concern when it comes to Beetaloo Basin, for example, and the many Indigenous communities there. And so obviously, in the context of the government was willing to constitutionally enshrine and listen to the voices of First Nations, well, here is a practical opportunity to listen to their voices and concerns when it comes to use of water around gas fracking. So we have put the challenge out there. I seconded Sophie's bill. Sarah Hanson-Young presented it, tabled it in the Senate as well. So, and the issue is the government actually, ironically, has said it intends to close the loopholes around the water trigger, right? It has recognised this as a policy area, but hasn't provided a timeline and is actually really dragging their feet on the amendments to the EPBC Act. The Samuels review was in 2020. We still don't have amendments and closures of loopholes that are significant, and we have ongoing approvals occurring. So we're really failing to protect and arrest that biodiversity loss that's happening. So really important that progress. And obviously many of you would be aware of the recent court decision that found the Environment Minister had not failed in applying her duties in declining to consider climate impacts of proposed approvals. Now, that raises great questions, I think, and many think, around whether or not our current environmental laws are fit for purpose when it's clearly acknowledged that climate impacts are one of the greatest environmental threats to biodiversity and conservation. And so we need to upgrade our laws to reflect the current threats to if that is the purpose of that legislation. So there's clearly, I think, a lot of work to be done by the government when it comes to that. But look, I do acknowledge that one of its first order of business was to pass a Climate Change Act to enshrine in law net zero by 2050. Very good. It did, and its election commitment of 43 by 2030, which we all know is insufficient to stay true to the Paris Agreement and the temperature goals of keeping to 1.5 or at least under 2 degrees. Current trajectory is terrible when it comes to temperature goals, and we have to accelerate ambition. So, sorry, Stephen and Carolyn, I've done a much broader answer to your question, but fire away with the next one.
Well, you probably perhaps covered some of, what we were going to ask you anyway. But I suppose, yeah, looking ahead for this term of Parliament,
What's next?
Apart from what you've already mentioned.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously some gains have been made with the passing of the Climate Change Act and the safeguard mechanism. Like, I know many are critical of the reliance on ACCUs, and that is problematic. I certainly feel they play a role when it comes to trying to get to drawdown and to really getting to negative emissions. But obviously, if we keep making the problem worse, there's no amount of offsetting that's ever going to help us. So, and at the moment, that is a little bit of the dilemma. So on every query around approvals of new coal or gas projects, the Environment Minister relies on the safeguard mechanism to offset any negative impact or to deal with the climate impact of those decisions. And I don't think that's really sufficient. We need to be focused on not continuing to make the problem worse, because when or if offsets are not found, or if there are problems around the offsetting aspects, and there's a lot of debate around that, we will be left with having continually made the problem worse when it comes to emissions. And we know currently they're still increasing. Transport sector in particular is increasing, and the government, whilst it has now accepted to look at emission standards for cars, it really hasn't come through with the roadmap or the plan for it just yet. Every delay is important. The Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, has now instructed the Climate Authority to report back on sectoral targets by 1st of July 2024. Now, again, that is a good move to finally be requesting that, but I would remind we've been asking for sectoral targets since I introduced the Climate Change Act draft legislation, back in 2019. So I think sectoral targets is desperately needed so that we progress all our sectors, not just the energy sector. And unfortunately, on the current timeline, we've got 1st of July reporting back by the Climate Authority and then the government to respond, which means it's essentially an issue for the next election. So again, there is that delay which we just can't afford to have. We need to get moving on all these sectors, and investment is waiting for these sectors for clarity for what they need to do. So really important there. The other thing that's coming up by the end of the year is after I had some negotiations with the government around the safeguard mechanism and wanting a greater accountability around methane. We know methane is 80 times more potent in the first 20 years in capturing heat. And as we accelerate towards tipping points and temperature tipping points, I think it's really clearly evident that we have to be mindful of what warming occurs in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be proportionally more significant than probably at any other time, because it's going to get us closer to those tipping points that we simply won't be able to reverse. And methane is an incredible accelerator of that. So whilst government still does the talking points of it's a transition fuel, the same way as the coalition did, there's a real concern that we're accelerating the problem with that. We still have methane, poor data measurement. It's still looking at facility averaging. We don't have actual measurement, but we do have technology coming. So we know University of Melbourne and others are looking at technology that combines satellite imaging that is now incredibly precise with measurements and particular cameras that can capture that and calculate the actual emissions. And it's fairly widely thought that we are dramatically underreporting our methane emissions. There is a concern that it could be up to 60%. So that would mean our baseline is completely off the mark, and it means that any emissions reduction achieved by the Climate Act or the Safeguard Mechanism are completely invalidated because the starting point is simply incorrect. So the government agreed that this is a problem, and the ENGER Act review was commissioned and is occurring at the moment, and the Climate Authority took submissions on that and will be reporting back by the end of the year in its climate statement on what is required to tighten up the data measurement and what should happen with methane. So obviously we need to be capturing methane, we need to be measuring leaks and ensuring there is no leaking of methane, whether it's from fossil fuel projects, but it's actually data shows that methane leaks is occurring from all levels of extraction and transport and delivery of methane. And so it's a pretty widespread problem. And so really, and this is not an impossible solution to fix. We have the technology to do it, and we now also have technology, these in particular heat cameras that show the leaking occurring in real time. But the problem is at the moment there's no regulatory requirement on companies to do anything about it. So hopefully by the end of the year we will have recommendations to the government to tighten up the ENGER Act review and particular requirements around reductions when it comes to methane. And so that I think will be incredibly important before the end of, well, by the end of this term of government. So by the commitment from the minister was that he would act upon recommendations promptly. So Terry can, tell me on that, but we will be holding them to account on that because it's incredibly important. But concerningly, with the EPBC Act amendments, even in response to the water trigger today, the minister's response was, we're working on it and we intend to do something by next year. But this is a timeline that keeps moving out, and in the meantime, more projects are getting approved. So that's pretty concerning.
Sally, thank you so much. Have you got any parting words for us in terms of, I mean, I'm absolutely amazed by how across so much you are. So thank you for, all your work to make sure you really are, across so many policy areas. But yeah, have you got any sort of final pointers for us before you head off? Just like, what can we do?
Oh, well, continue on with the advocacy. We're trying to, obviously, during the last few months with the referendum, very hard to get much traction on other issues. So I feel like the media and the community has felt like, look, the government's ticked the box on climate action, and so let's talk about something else. And of course, we've had cost of living and many other issues and energy prices impacting that. But we are approaching the next COP. The government is wanting to host COP31. It should be required to be more ambitious before it has that opportunity. We have to do no more around preparation for climate impacts, especially our Pacific neighbours are desperately wanting that to happen. And that's obviously around our foreign aid and what happens there. I would say we need to really heat up the conversation on what our next national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement is going to be. I have started a campaign and I'm pushing for a minimum commitment of 75 by 35. We know our states are looking at those kind of commitments. We know, for example, the EU is at 80% by 2040. The UK is at 78% by 2035. Victoria has committed to 70 to 80% by 2035. So we need the federal government to get ambitious on this. Obviously, there is no political pressure from the opposition. The opposition has not updated its 2035 targets or 2030 targets and is very keen not to talk about the 2035 target. In fact, they are running this campaign around nuclear. And actually, anyone watching the House today may have picked it up or not, but there was finally a speech in the House where they revealed what we are all thinking that they're really talking about, where David Gillespie pointed out that we should, because of the difficulties of rolling out large-scale renewable and the transmission cost and all of that, that ultimately we should just continue on with coal-fired until nuclear becomes available down the road. So he finally said out loud what we all know they're thinking with the nuclear push, that it is really a delaying tactic to enable a continuation of relying on fossil fuel energy for another period of time. There's also some really interesting stats. The Labor member, Josh Wilson, did a great speech on highlighting around small modular reactors and nuclear, the recent update from NuScale around their small modular reactors, who are, the delivery date has been further pushed back to 2028. The costs have nearly doubled and the expected energy output is reducing on the go. So clearly there's a lot of data that I think all the proponents or anyone giving credence to this idea that small modular reactors are, the coming over the hill. We need to really emphasise the facts around that it's simply not plausible. It's a delaying tactic to avoid having to talk about what our interim measures are and our targets. So my plea to everyone is really raising the bar on the government around what its commitment is going to be for the 2035 target, because reminding everyone, this is the target it will take to the election. And then if it takes a low, politically convenient target, it will stick to that target post-election if they're successful. So you will not move it beyond that, and we won't get to a scientifically based target that actually does the job when it comes to emissions reduction. No one is saying this is easy, but without strong targets, we don't drive investment and you don't drive confidence as to the direction we're going in. And obviously with our trading partners introducing carbon border tariff adjustments, and we know the EU, the US, all are accelerating their transition, Australia will be left behind. So my plea to everyone is press the government on what its 2035 target is going to be and accelerate delivery of sectoral targets so all sectors are moving in emissions reduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. We'll let you go, but we really appreciate your time. It was great to hear that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Zali. Really appreciate you making the time after such a big day.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And good to see you, Terry.
That's a very nice intro. So I'm now delighted to introduce Terry Butler to speak to us. So Terry is the former federal member for Griffith in central Brisbane and the former Shadow Environment and Water Minister. She's also a lawyer, like Zali, by training, and is now president of the Smart Energy Council, chair of the Bioenergy Australia Task Force, which focuses on sustainable aviation fuels, also an advisory board member on Griffith University's Climate Ready Initiative, and a board member of the Motor Trades Association of Queensland. In the last 18 months, Terry's also been involved with Circular Australia, promoting the circular economy, and was the interim chair of Waste to Wealth, CRC bid, focused on addressing industrial waste. So there's lots there, Terry, and I know we've got lots to cover, and really the focus, I think, is going to be around that sort of climate action within industry. So I'll, without further ado, pass over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen and Carolyn, and thanks everyone for having me along. It's terrific to see you all, a few familiar faces, so g'day. Great to hear from Zali as well about some of the issues facing the federal parliament at the moment, and of course, the work that's being done across not just climate, but also environment. I have on my website some of the Labor commitments from the last election in relation to environment. So if anyone's interested, I thought I'd put them up there as a little archive in a convenient place. So I'll drop my website link up at the end. But for now, I have done a dry run of sharing the screen with Stephen and Carolyn earlier. So we'll see how that goes. Oh, look at that. Who would have thought that would work so easily? So as Stephen said, I'm doing a few different pieces of work with different industry associations. And when he and Carolyn and I met, they thought it might be nice just to talk about some of the work that those associations are doing with industry in relation to climate action. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Feel free to jump in with questions in the chat or however you usually do it. I'm totally relaxed, happy to take questions, of course. But thank you both, and also thank you for acknowledging country earlier on. Of course, it's been a pretty tough week, but it's, of course, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Jagera country, which is in, as you say, central Brisbane. I wanted to just kick off with the Sustainable Aviation Alliance that Stephen mentioned, because I think this is an interesting area where industry is really ahead of government in terms of taking action, really out of necessity. And I think somebody mentioned, I think it might have been Zali mentioned, the cross-border carbon mechanisms. Similarly, there's sort of other nations in the world are taking action in relation to decarbonisation of aviation, and we need to make sure that we're not left behind on those issues. It's not necessarily CBAMs or similar, but just introducing policy in relation to mandates, subsidies, and incentives. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this because I think it's really interesting. So as Stephen said, I'm the chair of the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. It's a task force of Bioenergy Australia. We've got a couple of other task forces. One is on renewable gas, actually, topical to what you were talking about. That's led by John Hewson, because we are very non-partisan. We're in the organisation. And the third task force is on renewable diesel, heavy haulage, road transport, decarbonisation. So quite interesting. And the organisation tends to work across industry. For our task force, there's about 160 members across airlines, airports, OEMs, manufacturers, fuel industry, agriculture industry, innovation, and more. And the thing you can see up on the screen is how the airlines members think we're going to decarbonise aviation towards 2050. So there's obviously this is a small proportion of global emissions at 2.5%, but it's hard to abate. And so as other sectors abate, we'll expect that 2.5% would grow unless we have abatement as well. The International Air Traffic Association and subsequently the International Civil Aviation Organisation, which is a UN organisation, have both passed resolutions for decarbonisation net zero by 2050. The graph you can see there on your screen is what airlines for Australia and New Zealand say are likely to be the contributors, potential to be the contributors to that decarbonisation. So you can see that the biggest chunk of decarbonisation that they propose is through sustainable aviation fuels, which is effectively biofuels, fuels from other feedstocks as well. In fleet modernisation and technology, that's where you would see hydrogen flights and electric flights. So important to note that it's not really about one thing. We've got to do everything all at the same time in order to get to a point where we're decarbonising aviation. If you were to have a look at the CSIRO Sustainable Aviation Fuel Roadmap that was released quite recently, it lists 5 main strategies for reducing emissions for carbon abatement in relation to aviation. That's improving the fuel efficiency by adopting new fuels and implementing more efficient aircraft movements, exploring new propulsion technologies such as battery and fuel cell electric planes, as well as hydrogen combustion, utilising carbon offsets, considering flight alternatives like high-speed rail and video conferencing. So you don't see that in this graph from A4NC because it's actually about decarbonising flights and it's from airlines. But CSIRO rightly points out that we should be thinking about high-speed rail and just more online meetings rather than in person if possible. And then the 5th point from CSIRO is sustainable aviation fuel and developing that. So a lot of people actually ask me when I talk about this, what do you even make it from? How does it actually work? So I thought I'd pop up this graph, this chart, I should say, from the CSIRO roadmap. It was a roadmap that was released quite recently. They ran it with Boeing because it was an industry sector piece of work, and it gave you this sort of example of what the feedstocks that might be used for sustainable aviation fuel are. And I mentioned sugar before to Stephen and Carolyn before the meeting. So things like agricultural residues, bagasse from sugar, at the moment it's just going to waste. It's not being used, it's being burnt. So it's an opportunity to consider how waste products might be able to be used to decarbonise aviation through the production of sustainable aviation fuel. The big impediment to the uptake of this is cost, as you'd expect. So this gives you, the dotted line is the kind of current trajectory for traditional jet fuel, combustion jet fuel, CJF price, and you can see that the different types of sustainable aviation fuels still have a high cost profile. And so the question for governments around the world is, well, if SAF is going to be a major contributor to decarbonising aviation, and it's got this cost issue, then what do we do about it? And of course, where there's land travel available, then high-speed rail, other options are terrific. But if you're in Australia and you want to get to San Francisco, it's pretty hard to get a train there. So we have to actually deal with this issue. And if we don't, we're going to end up in a situation where, it's going to get harder and harder to fly internationally. So it's an interesting challenge that our members are trying to work on. The advocacy that the organisation is doing is in relation to the sector. So different parts of the sector, for example, agricultural firms, ag tech firms, so innovators who are looking at different ways of using different feedstocks to create sustainable aviation fuels, traditional fossil fuel firms, manufacturers, all different parts of industry working on how to actually get to this decarbonisation situation, because they know that the way that the globe is going, the international commitments that have been made, there's not really any alternative. So it's good to see industry really leading on this, and government policy has lagged industry action. For example, here in Australia, we don't really have any policy settings in relation to sustainable aviation fuel yet. So the federal government was elected, as we know, in May last year. The focus in Australia had been about, of course, naturally, abatement of electricity generation and to a lesser extent, road transport, because it's a much bigger emissions producer. But some of that abatement is a little bit easier, of course, with EVs. Sustainable aviation fuel hasn't really been on the radar. Our organisation was really strong in advocating for it to be on the radar, along a suite of different ways to reduce emissions for the aviation sector. So the government created the Jet Zero Council, modelled on something that's done in the UK, in Canada, in New Zealand, which has brought together CSIRO, CEFC, ARENA, Defence Department, Infrastructure Department, Climate Department, Aviation sector to work on actually creating a work plan for Australia to fill that policy gap. We're also lagging internationally. People would know that the Inflation Reduction Act has some sustainable aviation components to it in the form of subsidies, tax credits. Refuel EU has incentives and mandates for the use of sustainable aviation fuel. And Japan has recently announced a 10% SAF mandate to be brought in they're announcing it in advance so that the sector can get ready for it over there. There's a lot of work that's being done around the world. So the question for us is, what do we do? It's also being picked up through the Aviation Green Paper, which, as people will know, submissions are due for that Green Paper by the 30th of November. So that's really timely. It was picked up in the Defence Strategic Review because, of course, Defence is a large procurer of jet fuel. The government has now established a National Fuel Council arising out of that review. So this issue will be taken into account in that. It also ties in with fuel security for obvious reasons. So that's a little overview of the SAF work. I wanted to now talk to you about the Smart Energy Council. I know we've got Tim Buckley on the call. G'day, Tim, who knows a lot about what the Smart Energy Council does, of course, as such an actively involved person. So thank you, Tim, for all of your work consistently across a very long time. The Smart Energy Council, for those of you who don't know, is the independent body for the Australian smart energy industry. We've got over 950 members. And it's actually one of, frankly, the world's oldest industry associations. It's 65 years old because it was actually established by a group of photovoltaic pioneers in the 1950s and 60s who designed and built some of the world's first solar panels. So it's been going strong ever since. We had our national conference and exhibition in May this year, and it was a massive, massive event. Tim was there, of course. But the great thing about it is it's part exhibition and industry association, opportunity to display products and services, and part platform for really influential advocacy, including political advocacy. Zali, I think, came and spoke with some of the other crossbenchers. We had government people there. We had Greens people. No current Libs, I don't think, Tim, but Wyatt Roy, former Turnbull era Innovation Minister, was a speaker in his capacity as working in the solar sector now as well. So really great event for those of you who have been. Thank you. For those of you who haven't been, we're holding it in March 2024. Please consider coming along. Our organisation, as I say, is really focused on building the smart energy industry. So again, it's opportunities for industrial work on climate change and taking climate action through industrial means. A big focus for us is international delegations. We're about to kick off our China delegation in a couple of weeks' time. And we had a big delegation to India earlier this year in March. Those delegations are important because they build connections internationally between industry and our country and industry internationally, opportunities for business to be done, opportunities for us to also share our Australian expertise internationally. We do major domestic events. In addition to our national conference and exhibition, I just want to mention Smart Energy Queensland, which is the state's biggest ever renewable energy conference, was held in September in Queensland. It was great to be there and to get to speak on the panel. We had amazing representation from the Queensland government, who saw it as a real opportunity to talk up their energy and jobs plan, which is a plan that is all about creating smart energy jobs and building energy infrastructure and supporting renewables from a low base. It has to be said, when they took government, they've really focused on stepping that up. So it's really terrific to get to be involved. We provide also training, industry updates, and we have some terrific working groups as well. But the thing I really want to mention in terms of how industry and government can intersect is the advocacy that we do through work at a national and at a state level across all of the states to try to get industry knowledge to inform policy development. It's really important. So, for example, we worked on the Australian Renewables Industry Summit. That was in mid-September. That was a summit to call on government to have a $100 billion response to the Inflation Reduction Act. And we brought together industry, the ACTU, we partnered with them, I should more accurately say, the Australian Conservation Foundation, Climate Action Network, Climate Capital Forum, which of course Tim is heavily involved in, to bring that group together to call for a really strong response. And as people know, this is important because it can inform the work that's done by industry, by households, and by government in relation to scaling up renewable energy in this country. We also have a great hydrogen division, Zero Carbon Hydrogen Australia, which I'll mention to you. It's been working on, of course, making sure that there's an appropriate hydrogen policy framework. They were happy to see that the government announced the Hydrogen Head Start program, which was a $2 billion program announced in the budget this year, something that they'd advocated for really, really extensively. was support for hydrogen. We've got a transport section that's working on those fuel emission standards issues that Zali mentioned before, so really pressing the government to deliver them. We've campaigned really strongly to call on the government to legislate them by the end of this year and have them enforced by January. We want really strong fuel efficiency targets. It'll mean a higher standard of car is actually imported into Australia because we won't be able to be a dumping ground for those less efficient vehicles. It's really important for abatement in the transport sector. We brought our battery members and the opportunity to inform the government's national battery strategy consultation, which was earlier this year. Our PV members in Queensland have been heavily involved in the solar PV recycling pilot that we've been running with the Queensland government, which is now going into phase 2. It's complicated in Queensland because of our geography. Of course, people would be aware that PV recycling is essentially an economic difficulty. It's not so much a technological difficulty, but the question is, how do you actually pay the costs of the logistics of collection, safety issues, making sure that you get things done properly. So we've been working on that with the involvement of our solar PV members, which has been terrific. We've got a great workforce development focus. Really, at the heart of that is our gender action plan. So Nicolette Bowler, whom I'm sure you all know, from New South Wales, is leading the work on that, doing a terrific job. She's of course, our Electrify Everything consultant and advisor, but she's taking the lead on the Gender Action Plan, has put together a terrific advisory board for it, because we know that if we're going to be able to deliver the smart energy of the future, we're actually going to need to scale up the workforce, and that means we can't afford to ignore half the talent pool. And as I mentioned, we've had some really great involvement in the Climate Capital Forum, led by Blair Polisi, but Tim, as I said, is an advisor on that forum as well, as is Wayne Smith from our organisation, Joanna Kay, Nicolette's on there as well. We're lucky to have White Roy involved, Stephen Pfeiffer, who I've forgotten, and Satya Tanna, who I actually went to school with in Cairns in the 90s, so it's terrific to reconnect with her on that as well. Last thing I promise, and I think we're okay on time, Climate Ready Initiative. That's a thumbs up from Stephen, thank you. The last one I wanted to mention is the Climate Ready Initiative. So this is interesting because it's industry and it cuts across a lot of different types of work that's being done. It's also the not-for-profit sector. So this is the university decided to put together this partnership-based social impact initiative to really work with not-for-profit organisations, industry organisations, professional organisations, to find a collectively developed shared agenda for climate action to help not just with getting decarbonisation underway, but also climate adaptation. It's part of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon, which is a really interesting interdisciplinary unit within the university that can work with effectively anyone. And I wanted to just mention to you our flagship project, which is Climate Ready Australia. If people are interested in the shared agenda, it's up on the website for this organisation. It's really worth a look, but its pillars are enabling policy, capacity building, accelerating decarbonisation, and adaptive resilience. And these are the different peak organisations that we're working with as part of this Climate Ready Australia 2030 flagship project. So they're all deeply engaged with creating the shared agenda, developing the projects that the university is undertaking as part of this project. And they're, as you can see, it's quite a diverse group of organisations, and it's quite a useful, I think, quite a useful, diverse group of people who can talk to their own members about climate action and climate readiness. So an interesting output from that work is this set of infographics that have been produced to map climate policy across Australia. One of the things that we were being told by all the different organisations that are involved with their organisation was that they don't really know what the policy frameworks are or how to find out. So this is one of 10 slides that really seeks to map the different types of climate policy across the different jurisdictions. You can see the attributions are up on the screen. It's only a snapshot though. If you want to have a look at the actual slides, with the full attributions, they're on the Climate Ready Australia website, which I've included there for you, and I'll shoot these to you afterwards, Stephen and Carolyn, in case people want to take a look. We're also running a national summit in November this year. Registrations are still open. You can have a look at our website if of interest. It's going to be quite a terrific couple of days. I'm really looking forward to it. A lot of good thought leadership presentations on day one, and day two is capacity building, so it should be really, really lovely. And I'm I'm really looking forward to being there for part of the work that they've been doing as well. Finally, I just wanted to give a little plug to this survey, which I have sent through to Stephen and Carolyn. This was something that our group did with Climate Action Beacon. It was only released in September this year, so the survey is 2022, but the analysis is actually a pretty substantial piece of work and has been put together and distributed through that survey. It is available online, and I really encourage you to have a look at it if you want to. That is how to find me. And I reckon I've got some questions here in the chat. So
Yeah, that's great, Terry. Thank you so much. And we'll send that survey around actually, so to everybody. Yes, thank you very much. So that's a great overview. Lots of interesting, good things happening there. So any questions for Terry, please put them in the chat. And I might just sort of kick off myself, just a nice broad one. So obviously lots of good things happening there, Terry. But when you think about the gaps or barriers that are holding back faster transition in some of these areas, what do you see there?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, because I think what we've had, prior to the last federal election is a decade of uncertainty, and we saw the impact that had on frankly the diligence with which transition was pursued. I remember in 2014, as a new member of Parliament, Tony Abbott had commissioned the review of the RET, for example. And it killed investor confidence, because everyone knew that what he was really trying to do was to try to attack it. But I think the worst part about what he was doing was that he was really sending that strong signal that it was okay not to take action on climate change. And it was a signal that was continued, unfortunately, for quite a long period of time. And now here we are trying to play catch-up footy. So I think, what we are seeing is that when you do have some investor confidence, you will see movement, but also when you have governments that are really committed to climate action, you'll have some movement. So, for example, I mentioned the Queensland government. A massive amount of energy and effort is going into not just through the clean energy, not just through the energy and jobs plan, but through the new industries strategy, trying to look at opportunities for diversifying the economy that also provide sustainability, clean energy, and all of those different benefits that come with diversifying, but also doing it in a way that creates jobs for future industries. So, short answer, if we want to speed things up, we've got to have policy certainty, and we've got to have governments that actually believe that climate change exists for a start and are willing to take action.
Yeah, fantastic. And what about, do you have any thoughts regarding the balance between obviously the transition to renewables versus protection of nature, and the impact of the transition on biodiversity and things?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think that the point Zali made before about wanting to look at the triggers in the EPBC Act is really important. From our perspective, you'll hear, for example, the Smart Energy Council talking about the desire to speed up approvals to get things through faster, because there's a delay in getting renewable energy projects, large scale renewable energy projects off the ground, because of the time that it takes to get approvals through. So you have to, I think, be a little bit careful when you're looking at the intersection between nature and projects generally, that you don't have unintended consequences. I also think it's probably, the starting point is we have several obligations under international conventions for biodiversity protection. Those things inform the matters of national importance under the EPBC Act. They necessarily trigger obligations that needs to be at the forefront of any reform of the EPBC Act. So you actually have to put nature. The whole point of having the EPBC Act is to put nature first. There are other mechanisms in relation to climate impacts of projects that you can do elsewhere, including through climate legislation. But you have to strike that balance, and you also have to uphold your international obligations. So, for example, where there's Ramsar wetlands or where there's threatened species. The major impediment, I think, that the government probably has is not necessarily one of striking the right balance in the legislation, but it's one of getting the corporate knowledge and capacity back into the public service after the gutting of the Environment Department a decade ago. We're still seeing the long tail of that, and really the delays in relation to approvals and assessments are probably more attributable to the gutting of the department and the loss of capacity there. They did announce about a 50% increase in staffing for DQ at the last federal budget, though it was one of the departments that was recognised as really needing a scale up in personnel. So that's good, but you're kind of turning around a massive ship, going from a situation where, if you have a look at some of the reports into biodiversity under the former government and just the decisions being made not to pursue threatened species recovery plans because they didn't have the people to do it, it's a lot to try to turn around. So I know that's a long answer, but the short answer is you need to get the legislation right. You need to put biodiversity and nature at the forefront of anything under the EPBC Act. You need to look at other options for climate in climate legislation, and you need to make sure that the capacity is there in the public service to make sure you're getting good quality but fast decisions.
And is that capacity in the public sector, is that, I know it takes a long time, but is that developing, do you think? I mean, there's a big focus on that.
Look, it's been 6 months since the federal budget where they've funded the scaling up of the workforce. I don't have any particular insight into it. I'm not kind of involved in the internals of the public service, but I can tell you that was on my mind at the last federal election as something that needed to be really rapidly addressed should we win.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Terry. I might bring Tim Buckley. I might bring you into the conversation here. Terry's mentioned your name a few times, and wouldn't mind just your thoughts. And also, you've got quite a specific question here, which would be good if you maybe just want to sort of talk to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Terry, for your presentation, and good to see you again. SAF is certainly a really important area, and I'm just wondering, I mean, it's relatively long way from commercialization, mainly because we just don't have the price on carbon emissions. So what sort of policy, in the absence of being able to put in a price on carbon, like let's go back a decade to where we were, but in the absence of that, how do you think we actually commercialize SAF and get the right policy signals? Because as you mentioned, it's a critically important sector in the economy that's going to be really hard to abate. And SAF, as you pointed out, it's going to be a key part of the solution, but you need a price signal, you need we'll rephrase it, you need a policy signal to underpin and crowd in private capital.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's complicated, right? Because here's I put up the slide before about the various feedstocks that could be used to make sustainable aviation fuel. All of them can get a decent price in international markets because there are policies in the US and the UK, and as I say, Japan, but also elsewhere, and the EU, I should say, that are effectively demand signals or subsidies, creating opportunities for people to take feedstock and turn it into SAF. So first question is, how do you even secure the feedstock that we need in order to manufacture SAF here? Second question is, how do you give the potential manufacturers, the refiners, the confidence to invest in the infrastructure that is needed? And then the third question is, how do you make sure that there's actually then a customer for the end product, which is obviously the airlines. At the moment, Qantas is able to refuel overseas, Virgin not so much, but there's another very big potential customer for SAF in Australia, and that's the Australian government through the Defence Force. So those are kind of, like everything, it's primarily an economic question. And that's why the CSIRO roadmap was so important, because it really grapples with those issues. But it's also why policy is important. So there's a whole range of, it's a kind of a suite of different policy options, but they effectively boil down to mandates, subsidies, or procurement style policies. You can have a mix of all three of those. One of the things that we called for really early on was a 10% target in defence aircraft as a procurement policy rather than as a government kind of regulatory approach, which would then create a demand signal, which would say to the market, actually, there would be a market for SAF produced here. Some nations, for example, some of the Nordic nations have opt-in opportunities for public servants to fly. Kind of like when you say you want to pay extra for an offset, but saying you want to pay extra for SAF, which actually exists and is a real thing and decarbonizes, not to be critical of offsets, but you could certainly do that. But at the end of the day, we have a particular incentive to get some policy settings in place. And that is that we are isolated from the rest of the world. We and New Zealand. New Zealand actually had a plan for, you recall, they were going to have a fuel mandate. There was a sub-mandate plan within that for SAF under some of the material that was being worked up. that was all put on hold indefinitely. And I imagine we're not going to see it being brought back onto the table anytime soon in New Zealand. But you certainly, mandates are a policy option. That, as I said, if you do them in a way, the thing about Japan doing it with a big runway, no pun intended, is that you've got the demand signal, but you don't have the actual, the rubber doesn't hit the road until a few years later. So you can say, all right, well, you know that by X date, this is going to be a mandate that exists. If you want to fly into our airports, you have to use this amount of SAF. That then creates the demand signal before the actual need to use the SAF, which means that the infrastructure can be developed. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to, there's an importance for saying, all right, do we actually care that most of our used cooking oil is being exported for other people to refine and turn into SAF? Do we want to value add onshore? Is that important to us as a country? Are there non-economic reasons like fuel security reasons that we might want to actually do something about having policy in place there? Do we actually want to think about the potential ag tech benefits? Some of the work that's being done by some of the firms to look at whether it's different ways of cropping, different ways of creating SAF from different feedstocks. Do we want to invest in that? At the moment, the kind of subsidy piece is pretty small. ARENA has a $30 million round that's open at the moment for sustainable aviation fuel projects. There's some corporate venture capital around. Qantas has a $200 million fund that's shared with Airbus that is looking to fund projects in relation to SAF. They've got one in Far North Queensland that they're working on. So it's sort of trying to get all the pieces to line up, but it's certainly not going to be easy. I guess what I'd be really worried about is in a situation where it ends up that, the only way for people to get SAF is overseas. I think that's a kind of a bad outcome for Australia. It's an insecure outcome. It's an expensive outcome. We'll see what happens in the next few years, but I think we're already lagging the rest of the world on policy and we need to get it right. I'm not sure about hemp, actually. Definitely some oil seeds are. I imagine you could use hemp bagasse, but I'm not 100% sure. I reckon the CSIRO report might be a good place to start if you're interested.
Martin's asking about if there's any impact on food production or forest loss. I think it sounds like it's coming more from waste. Is that?
Well, it depends. So this is a really important piece of work that we need to make sure is 100% there. I just want to show you what the CSIRO report says about that, because it only works if people have assurance that that sustainability is being maintained and it's not creating, for example, biodiversity loss. So there's international certification. Let's see if I can show you this. International certification for sustainability. No, I can't actually find the page I was thinking of to show you off the top of my head, but there are international certifications for sustainability that you can get. I think we also need sustainability assurance that is specific to Australia. I think that's important. So you will not have a SAF sector unless you actually have assurance in terms of land use, but also impacts on biodiversity. Where there's some opportunity is cropping in marginal land, cropping in the off-season in fallow land, or using marginal land that can't be used for food crops. Obviously, sugarcane, it's not a land use change because you're using the waste product. So it doesn't become a dichotomy of you using it for food or you're using it for fuel. You're still getting the calories from the sugarcane. There is some work being done to create a higher fiber cane that has the same sugar yield, but also more fibrous material that can be used for these purposes. So you actually you can't allow a situation where you could have unintended consequences on either biodiversity or food. And that's part of the work that's being done in the CSIRO report, and also really in any of the work that's being done on this issue in Australia, because everyone's very conscious of the social license question.
Great, thanks, Terry. Bit sort of on a bit of a tangent here, but any thoughts around shipping? I know there's been quite a bit in the press about that, and Peter asked a question here about coastal shipping, but I just wondered if you had any comments around just shipping generally.
Yeah, look, I think so. This is a really important point. I think we always have to think about feedstock as going to highest value use, and for me, that's the hard to abate sectors, and shipping is certainly in that same category as aviation. So what you really want to see is, I think, in aviation, once you have hydrogen and electric online, so by the mid-2030s, for short haul and medium haul, they will be the preferred technology. So if you want to do a 2-hour flight, you'll be in a small electric plane or a small hydrogen plane. But there is no current and there is no realistic future technology that does a long haul flight other than SAF for decarbonisation. So in terms of a high value use for feedstocks, then I think long haul flights is a high value use. I think it's pretty clear that shipping is a high value use for potential renewable fuels as well. A lot of the work that's being done is in relation to the fact that we do actually have a lot of feedstock. And the issue is not so much feedstock availability in terms of if domestic feedstock was being used domestically, would we have enough? It's the broader issue is that the prices on overseas markets are so attractive that you probably your more salient competition point is competition with other jurisdictions for value adding.
Thanks. There's also a question about hydrogen coming from Martin, looking at thermodynamic, transportation, storage and safety challenges with the use of hydrogen. I don't know if you wanted to comment about that.
It's a bit tricky for me, Martin, but because it's not really my field, but I think it would be worth considering. I think I mentioned to you, Stephen and Carolyn, that we've got a terrific green hydrogen organisation within Smart Energy Council, 2 terrific leaders of that, Joanna Kay and Scott Hamilton, really terrific people. So I reckon if you're going to do a hydrogen conversation, they'd be really, really great people to have along. I think the safety question, it's a question that I would ask as well. We've got a startup in Queensland called Stralis that are working on hydrogen flights. I don't know if people know them. Really terrific small organisation, but of course they're trying to grapple with the safety questions around hydrogen fuel cells as well. But for them, you're really talking, I mean, hydrogen is just a little bit further away. There's not really, save for catching the train, there's not really a current technology that can decarbonise aviation really sufficiently at the moment. Hydrogen is a way off and so is electric. I think the useful thing to know about SAF is that it's already certified, it already exists. It's a drop-in fuel. The blends of 10% are happening now. It's certified by the International Aviation Organisation, the international standards bodies. It's actually certified for drop-in up to 50%. And you can, the drop-in that's happening now of 10% that's happening all the time is using the same infrastructure at the airports. So no kind of transaction costs in terms of changing the infrastructure for refueling. Whereas hydrogen and electric, that'll be quite a different story.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Malcolm asks, is there a pathway to creating a CO2 price signal in the market?
So I think, look, the one I know about a little bit about is the low carbon fuel standard in California, which is, a terrific piece of a market-based mechanism, which we're very familiar to people in this organisation, I'm sure. It's technology neutral and feedstock neutral. I don't know how that would go down, frankly, in Australia from a social licence perspective. We'd probably want a few more assurances around what goes in. But it's a good model. It's a good model to take a look at. And we had someone from the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition from the US come and speak to our Renewable Fuels Week in May, which was terrific. It's a really good source of inspiration. So you could certainly look at that. You'd have to do it nationally in Australia. I don't think you could have a state-based low carbon fuel standard because you'd have to work out how it would interact with the safeguard mechanism and other national policies. But it's certainly something that exists. I think that's the closest thing. A mandate would create a demand signal, which in some ways will create the investment environment that will create opportunities for development here. Subsidies, tax credits like the IRA would have a similar effect. Procurement would have a similar effect. There's sort of this mix of different policies that you can look at. If anyone's interested, ICAO have a great piece of document. It's about a year old that lists every different type of policy that was being used on SAF around the world to create signals and to create opportunities for growing sectors. So that's publicly available on the ICAO website. That's the International Civil Aviation Organization website. So that's worth a look to if you are interested in these kind of policy questions. We are, the SAFANS, the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance, is leading together with some of the other participants in the Jet Zero Council, including the oil refineries, the piece of work in relation to policy settings to try to give government some options that they can look at for Australian policy. That's underway. I think, you know, it's an interesting question because we've got the isolation, we've got the small population over the big landmass, we've got the long distance travel, and then on top of that, we've got this kind of quite small aviation sector with the regional airlines more likely to be looking to the future for technologies that will decarbonise, and governments trying to look at alternative kind of intermodal, but also alternatives for shorter haul aviation in Australia. It's quite a specific, I mean, I suppose everyone thinks they're special, but I feel like Australia's got a particular set of conditions that make it a little bit more complicated. So it's certainly not easy, but we just can't afford not to do it, because what I don't want to see happen, and what I think most people wouldn't want to see happen, is the, you know, sort of the adverse distributional impacts of really significantly reduced access to aviation. You don't want to see a situation where you have to be incredibly rich to be able to fly overseas. But if we can't decarbonise aviation, then we end up in a situation where the only option is a significant reduction, and the flow-on impacts to prices that would bring with it. I don't think that people, you know, want to see that. We may, you know, who knows what sort of world we'll live in 2035 or 2050. But I think that, as with all climate adaptation, climate mitigation measures, you cannot look at the technology and the economics without also thinking about the distributional and justice impacts of those. And I think that that's a really important piece of work in aviation, as it is in energy generation, as it is in EVs, as it is in everything that we do. So I just wanted to, I think it's important that we do work on this. It's or else we just end up. Has anyone ever been on a Concorde? You know, the days of luxury flying and the giant. I only say this because I went to the Aviation Museum in Seattle. They've actually got a Concorde there you can walk through. I haven't flown on one, obviously, but as glamorous as I'm sure it was, I don't think anyone wants to go back to those days where flying was the exclusive preserve of the very wealthy.
Yeah.
I was recently, somebody said you can't really address every environmental challenge actually has a social challenge as well, which I thought was wise. So again, Terry, you know so much. I'm blown away by how across so many different questions you've been as well. I've got one last one for you, which I suppose is, you know, what are the things that we can do? A lot of us are in business of various different sorts. What can we do, you know, I suppose for ourselves, but also perhaps in our work lives? What are the opportunities to get involved or find out more?
Yeah, look, really great piece of work that you're doing here to bring people together and talk about opportunities for taking action in your own lives. There's just a lot of, I think one of the things I love about the Smart Energy Council, for example, is that it is a really activist organisation that draws its strength from the industry members. And so if you've got first-hand experience and ideas in how things can be done to improve your sector, or to improve your sector's contribution to carbon reduction or adaptation actually as well, significant and important, then there are so many opportunities to convey that through advocacy mechanisms that funnel into government. And that's one of the things I love about the Smart Energy Council, is that it is really, really strongly active in advocacy on a whole range of, I mean, I mentioned some of them to you before, but it just scratches the surface. And similarly with the other organisations I talked about, you know, the Griffith Uni mob that I'm involved with, one of the things I love about them is they bring together different, as I said, a diversity of peak bodies with really different memberships and organisations involved, who are all looking at ways that they can make a contribution to carbon reduction and climate, well, I should say emissions reduction, not just carbon, given the methane conversation we had before. But, you know, the kind of emissions reduction, but also climate adaptation piece that's being done. So getting involved in organisations like this one that you have set up, Carolyn and Stephen, and industry associations is a really terrific way to feed your first-hand frontline experience in terms of what can be done into policy advocacy. And I think policy advocacy is incredibly important right now. You know, the government, but all of the governments really have been consulting like mad, trying to get broad buy-in and engagement across all sorts of things, from fuel efficiency standards to the way the safeguard mechanism works to, you know, what's the future gas strategy going to be? What's the national battery strategy going to be? How is the EV sector going to work? All of these different things that are being done. The best thing you can do is try to participate in those consultation mechanisms, because they're really important. They're going to set the climate policy for a reasonable period of time to come. And I think the point that Zali made about asking governments to lift their ambitions, really important. Really important. Government needs to hear from people that people actually care about this issue. So I always encourage people, write to your local MP, write to your senators, write to your state MPs and your state upper house people, and just keep reminding them of the importance, and not kind of form letters, collectivism, that sort of stuff's not particularly effective, but actual personal letters, emails, phone calls. Phone calls are great, really important as well in terms of encouraging government to lift their ambition, because there is no policy without political economy. There's no policy, means nothing unless you have a way to achieve it, and that means that you've got to tell government that it's going to be effective politically and electorally for them to take the action that you want them to take as well. And Ian, I've just seen as saying you're waiting for a yes to construct renewables transmission lines. And I think that really comes back to that point that Stephen asked about before, which is how do you make sure that you've got kind of a balance between the nature piece and the construction piece, when you've got you want to make sure that projects get a good approval as rapidly as possible without having to compromise on the quality of decision making in respect of environmental and biodiversity considerations. And it's yet another one of the challenges that we all face together. So good luck.
Thanks a lot, Terry. Well, and I'll bring things to a conclusion there. So thank you so much. What a fascinating session. Really, really great. So, and as always, there's always lots of really good information there in the Q&A as well. So a huge thank you, and thanks so much for all the great work you're doing and making the time this evening. And big thanks to Zali as well. So, and I hope to the group, I hope you've all found that really useful this evening, helped you understand a bit more about what's happening, re climate and the environment. Obviously, a bit of an update from Zali at Federal Parliament, and then from within industry with Terry there. So certainly there seems to be a sense that the momentum is there and continues to build. And I think it's up to all of us to keep that going in our own ways as well. Now, next month, we've got 2 more sessions left this year. So next month, we're going to hear really interesting, a bit different again, from 2 people, from Michael Boyle and Robin Craig. They're a husband and wife. They co-founded a company called Abergeldy Complex Infrastructure, which is now the largest locally owned civil construction contractors in Australia. But more specifically, what they did in 2013, they purchased a 365-acre property in Killeavy, South Armagh, Northern Ireland. So they live here in Sydney. They bought this land in Northern Ireland. This is near where Mick's parents were born and where he emigrated from with his parents to Australia in 1968. And they've now restored the farm and the historic buildings. It was an old castle, and it's now an award-winning hotel. And sustainability was the focus of the whole hotel design, build, and operation. So they're going to be talking about how they achieve this, and then the ongoing environmental focus going forwards as well. So that'll be really interesting. And then in December, we've got a session focused on bushfires. So we'll hear some people talking around that. So thanks again, Terry, and thanks again, all of you, for joining us, and see you again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Matt.
Okay.